Welcome to the February 28th, 2025 episode of The Energi Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and you will be viewing this at the earliest on February 29th. And the reason for that is we weren't able to do the show yesterday for domestic concerns, which basically is my condo cut off the water. I had no water in the house, and it kind of threw my day in a tizzy. And so we had to reschedule the interview with Troy Wason. Say hello, Troy.
Hello, everyone.
Troy is a friend of mine, and I've known him for a long time, and he is a historian by training and does a lot of historical research on Western Canada, particularly Alberta, and worked for the Progressive Conservative Association of Alberta for a time, and knew Peter Lougheed, who's the subject of today's interview, and knows a lot of the inside stories. And so the working title for today's show is Peter Lougheed's Energy Policy is the Template for Modern Canadian Energy Policy or Energy Strategy. So Troy, how I got into this story is somebody sent me a link to something Andrew Nikiforuk, the well-known independent journalist, had written in the Tyee back in 2012. And it was Peter Lougheed's 6 principles for energy development, oil and gas management. And here we are. Canada is being threatened by American President Donald Trump. He's we're going to put tariffs on. And I should note for any of you who aren't aware, yesterday he made an offhand comment about delaying them yet another 30 days. Then the White House came back and said, no, they're actually still going to be on for March 4th. It's just chaos. It's just utterly chaos. And this is his style. Trump creates chaos and then manages the chaos to get what he wants in the end. So this is kind of the background for why we're talking about Peter Lougheed is we've been at the Energi Show critical of Canadian leaders not having a strategy, a strategic approach to this. We're reacting all the time as opposed to having our own agenda. Well, Peter Lougheed had his own agenda. That is one of the brilliant things about him as I'm coming to understand more and more. So maybe, Troy, let's start there. Give us a little bit of Lougheed's background and where that vision for natural resources, particularly oil and gas in Alberta, where it came from.
Well, thanks, Markham. One of the things we have to sort of look at is where he came from in his past, but where he was going in his future. And if we start, just even when he was doing his MBA at Harvard, for a summer job, one summer he worked in Tulsa, Oklahoma for Gulf Oil. And so you already know that he starts being immersed in it at that time. He's already spent some time with the Americans and, of course, comes back. He goes into construction with the Mannix family. And then as he started to move into politics, you get a sense that it's there, but he's not really sure where it's going. But you always know with Peter that you always knew that he was 2 steps ahead of everyone else. And he knew that with his great grandfather being Senator James Lougheed, he knew that there was this federal idea of what Canada was. It was this confederation of 10 provinces. But this whole idea of provincial resources being under the control of province still was fairly sketchy in the 60s. And Peter knew that this was a thing that he wanted to get under control. He said to his wife on election night in 1971 that this was going to be something that it was his first priority. Okay. But then as I was going through my research, I'm looking through the Herald and the Albertan, and I'm for the first 71, 72, there's really not much. He's not really doing much. His ministers are doing things, and he's sort of finding his way. But I get a sense he's sometimes looking for that crisis that was going to change his the whole planetary realm that he was in. And what we get, is this idea that there's chaos going on, very similar to today. I mean, the story is so similar in the sense there is OPEC. There is the Vietnam War. There is Watergate. There is inflation. Oh my God, inflation was going up. There is, wage and price controls are being discussed. All these things are going on. the federal Liberals had just gone through a disastrous election in 72. Things are going weird. And all of a sudden, the Prime Minister of Canada, named Trudeau, of course, comes out and he says, oh, we got really beaten up badly in the West. So I'm going to put together a conference in Calgary or in the West. Turns out Calgary is the choice of the Premier of Alberta. He makes a pitch for it. And of course, that's where they choose. They chose Mount Royal College now, university. And I think the idea behind the Prime Minister was he's going to pull three NDP premiers together, Dave Barrett, Alan Blakeney, and Ed Schreier, with this new progressive conservative. But they'd all been elected by 68 to 72. They'd all been elected. So there wasn't really a lot of length time what was going on. They got together in Calgary, and I think the Prime Minister thought, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to get to divide and conquer, and this is going to be great. Lougheed figures out at that time that he's not going to get Energi on the table today. But he goes in and he starts to bring them and envelope them in together and say, okay, we got to worry about transportation, we got agriculture, we got these things that need to be dealt with today. Energi is always in the back of his mind. Resources are always in the back of his mind. What he gets out of it is, and it turns out it's a disaster. The Western Economic Organization or Opportunities Conference was an unmitigated disaster, but it's so important to the narrative. It's so important to the story because what it does is it brings them together. The West starts to coalesce together. But in January of 74, guess what? They get themselves a First Ministers Conference on Energi. And this is where everything starts to explode.
Okay, I got to say, I'm going to stop you right there.
Yeah.
Why are we talking about this? I brought, first of all, the parallels with today and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's fights with Pierre Trudeau's son, of all things. I mean, the parallels here are really for those of you who aren't aware, Smith became leader of the UCP and then premier back in 2022. So she had roughly 3 years of this, and it's been unrelenting, fighting with Ottawa and the Prime Minister over regulations to curb emissions. There's an oil and gas emissions cap and clean fuel regulations and on and on. Every sparrow that falls from the sky, Danielle Smith takes him to court or it launches a public relations offensive. And as a poor energy journalist, I get these things all the time. This is like a tsunami that never stops. So the parallels are there in that there's a fight between the province and the federal government. But now I want to bring in the 6 principles of Lougheed. So number 1, behave like an owner. And under the Canadian Constitution, the provinces control the resources. So you could basically say the people of Alberta control oil and gas, or own oil and gas. Collect your fair share. Don't just knuckle under to the companies. Take your fair share for the people. Save for a rainy day. And he started up the Heritage Fund, right? In the 70s. Yep. Add value. And his policies led to the creation of the modern petroleum cluster in Alberta, which is the second largest in North America. Go slow. It's no rush. Take your time. That might be a little different today. We're working in China time, not 70s time. But here's the thing that you just alluded to. Practice statecraft. That is almost extinct. It's almost extinct. Nobody does the old coalition building and the hard work behind the scenes to bring premiers and bring the public in to support an idea and maybe, might be opposing federal policy, might be supporting federal. Nobody does that anymore. It's culture war stuff that we've imported from the United States where we just demonize the other side and then everybody loses their on social media, and it's chaos. And that's not what Lougheed did. Talk a little bit about his views of statecraft.
Well, Mark, before we go even further than that, I want to talk a little bit about the fact that he also did some things that shook up the establishment. One, he nationalized an energy company, Alberta Energy Company, almost immediately. So on September 14th, my thesis is that September 14th, 1973, Lougheed becomes the man, the myth, the legend. And this is what I was leading up to. 6 weeks after the Western Economic Organization conference, the prime minister comes out with a oil tax. 6 weeks after saying, we want to help the West, and his mind explodes. Almost immediately, he goes to the Canadian Club in Calgary, and he says to them, "This is outrageous. This is devious. This is wrong." He starts up Alberta Energy Company. Boom! Almost immediately, 4 days after this, he has his moment in history to make his claim. But he's already done the background work, as you just said, with the other premiers. And I'm sure this expanded because what we find out is, outside of maybe perhaps Bill Davis for his own reason in Ontario, the other provinces are all on side with them at this time. He goes out and he buys PWA in the summer of 1974. The airline industry loses its mind because a province can't do that. There's Air Canada. No, there is. Sorry, go ahead.
Here's the point I want to make. In the practicing of these policies, he's not afraid to intervene.
Absolutely not.
And he said, if I remember correctly, because you're the one who provided me with this quote,
yes,
we're not conservatives. We just want to get stuff done.
That's exactly
he wasn't afraid to use public ownership, like buying the PWA, the airline. He wasn't afraid to create a crown corporation in Alberta Energy Company. He wasn't afraid to, and here's the thing, today Smith essentially rolls over for the oil company. She and her energy minister, Brian Jean, and her environment minister, Rebecca Schultz, are essentially cheerleaders. Every time the industry wants something, they bring out their pom-poms and they just repeat the narratives. And it's really, they've equated the public interest with industry interest. This came up in my work around the Alberta Energy Regulator, because it's a captured regulator because it identifies the public interest with industry interest. And this is Smith's government, but that is not how Lougheed operated, is it?
Well, and he wasn't kowtowing to the U.S. nationals either. What he was doing is he was building an industry within Alberta. The Canadian Hunters, the Anderson Explorations, these companies out of Alberta that were, they were wildcatters. They were it's a story. Some of it's a little fabricated, let's be honest about it, but it really was a great story. And, they chose right at the beginning, they chose home oil as, the hill to die on. Well, there were other Canadian companies, but when they were going to sell it off to another country, it was like, oh no, I think it was to the French. And they said, no, we got to protect it. This is a Canadian company. They were already nationalizing. I mean, before we get to the NEP, Alberta was already thinking about it. They were already going through it. And the fact that, and I love telling the story, and I know Markham, you love it because we've talked about it so many times. His honorary membership to the Petroleum Club was completely obliterated for a moment.
They banned him, right?
They banned him from the Petroleum Club in Calgary, of which I'm sure they've had something to do with his whole life. But the best part about it is he was so far ahead of them in his thinking. And I think this brings back to what your title is here, is he was ahead of them. He knew where he wanted to go with his ideas. And he took the next, roughly 12 years to get Alberta there. Was it successful? The fact we're still talking about this 50 years later is maybe it wasn't but it became a part of Alberta is here. And to your point is, we're not using statecraft today. We're not using it in the way that it should be used. You make friends. I mean, it's just the way it goes. I mean, the fact that Peter Lougheed was had made deals with Quebec, made deals with Newfoundland, even the person that brought out the Donald S. MacDonald of Pierre Elliott Trudeau's government, who brought in all this stuff that really sent his mind out. Here we go 15 years later, both of them are working free trade for Canada under Mulroney. And, there's Lougheed and there's MacDonald. This is what you call relationship building. And I think that's, you hit it on the head, Mark. This is what we're missing. And there's so many lessons in what's, put here. But I really think we need to look back to the year 73 in Canadian history. Alberta history is so important. And yet I asked you earlier today, have you ever heard of the Western Economic Opportunities Conference? No. but it should be something that people look at because it is an important part of statecraft, in Canada.
Let's look at he basically created the oil sands. I mean, he and was a huge part of that. And for those who, again, we have international viewers. So the Alberta oil sands is a 170 billion barrels, third largest reserve in the world of bitumen. And bitumen is a very interesting hydrocarbon molecule. It's very different than a light sweet crude, and it looks like peanut butter. It literally looks like peanut butter. It's thick. It won't even flow in a pipeline unless you put some lighter hydrocarbons in it. And that was sitting up in northern Alberta, and it really hadn't been developed. I mean, people were aware of it, but it hadn't been developed. And there was a project called Syncrude that the Alberta government, the federal government, even the Ontario government eventually got involved with, along with some major North American oil companies. And he was an instrumental part of that. And maybe just give us a little bit of the Syncrude story, Troy.
Well, I'm not as up on that one, but I do have. I mean, the story behind it is that one of the companies pulls out, and I'm sorry, Mark, you might remember the name.
Atlantic.
That's right. They pull out, and Alberta says we're going in for 20%. And I mean, Albertans lost their head. This is like a lot of money, and but it wasn't just. I mean, keeping in mind, it wasn't just the company; it was the technology that was being built there, and he also formed a company, an Alberta company called AOSTRA, Alberta Oil Sands Technology Research, whatever. Something. Anyway, the best part about it is this technology starts really, they're taking what they have, which was still not, as your point is, it's not flowing. It's not doing anything. It's just there. And we know that we can get it out. We just don't know what to do with it. And this technology, he starts it up, and it's game changing. You start to figure out how to get it to market. And this was always what he was about as well. It wasn't, again, it wasn't just pulling it out for the sake of drill, baby, drill. It was, how is it going to change culture? How is it going to change the environment? What is all these things? He was a big thinker. It wasn't about this small minutia, and it wasn't about ideology. And the quote that you're looking for, and I do have to say it for your viewers, we were not a conservative government, never pretended to be. We were an activist government wanting to get things done. And that is, I think, and he gave this interview, and it's not very widely disseminated, but it does say to you that it was never about being a progressive or conservative. It wasn't about ideology. It was about getting, looking at a constitution that rightly so is, to Nick Forrick, it was the policy was anyway. Sorry, go on.
Well, one of the things we've been, I know Danielle Smith well enough, and she used to be the Wild Rose Party leader back in the election of 2012, right, where she was forecast to win and lost it with some poor political decisions. Nevertheless, she's a known quantity. She's been around Alberta for 30 years as an opinion column writer for the Herald and a radio talk show host for QR 777, QR 7700, all of that for a long time. So the issue here is Lougheed comes in and over the course of a few years develops this really clear strategy. What he wants, he has goals and objectives. He has a strategy. He has a plan, and it's not just crown corporations or public ownership. There are regulatory issues around it. There are all kinds of. He pulls different policy levers, and this is an issue. I'll just make this point. We criticize Mark Carney, who's likely to be the next prime minister if he gets chosen as Liberal leader next week. We criticize him because the argument is he's a technocrat. He's an economist. He ran the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England. And as a technocrat, he likes to nudge policy levers, a whole bunch of them. Not pull one or two, nudge a whole bunch. Not a great approach in a crisis, the kind we're in now. Lougheed, on the other hand, he was pulling policy levers all over the place because he had a strategy. and a plan to implement the strategy. And he practiced statecraft and he developed public support and he stuck to his guns. He was a very charismatic kind of guy. All of those.
He also knew to compromise.
Yes. Fair game. Well, explain that if you would for my viewers.
He knew where he wanted to go with his policies. He knew where he wanted to go with his strategies, but he also knew that sometimes you don't get everything that you want. Interesting that PWA, which stood for Pacific Western Airlines, turned out to be, the moniker that maybe wasn't as favorable was Peter wants all. But he didn't want it all. He wanted fairness, and he wanted everyone to, there had to be a win-win, which is in quite contrast to our president to south of the border, who wants a win for him and a loss for everyone else. And he was a person that when he sat at a table, and there's a brilliant picture of him and John Turner, the finance minister, pointing at each other. But it was, at the end of it, there was a compromise. It wasn't the best thing. It wasn't necessarily what he wanted. But first and foremost, he was a Canadian. And second of all, he was an Albertan, a very proud Albertan, but he was a Canadian. And I think that's what's lost in all of this is, okay, we're going to go into these negotiations. Our people are going to be top notch. They're going to be prepared. They're going to be ready to go. But at the end of the day, we're going to come up with something that is favorable to both.
Yeah, this is something that's lost. Like you, I studied history in university and Canadian history.
Yeah.
And Canada is a decentralized federation. It doesn't have a strong federal government. It has a weak one and 10 strong provinces and then 3 territories. And though, interestingly enough, during the 70s, big debate over building a stronger central government. That was part of the tension between people like Lougheed and Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who really was, I mean, in his own right, a towering intellectual, very well known, smart as a bloody whip, and one of our best prime ministers. So there were all these tensions in the background, and it would take someone of Peter Lougheed's character, his qualities, his what's the word I'm looking for? But he had to be operate at that level, and you just don't see. There's not a premier in Canada right now who could hold a candle to him in terms of his ability to manage his politics. And when you're in it, when you have a weak central government and strong provinces, you have to build coalitions. You want something? Right. Okay, then you need to go to other provinces and you need to get them on board and you need to compromise. I'll give a little here, you give a little bit there. And those kinds of politics were dominated in Canada for decades, I might add. I mean, this is nothing new. But what's new today is we've replaced that approach with culture wars and ideological wars. And that is antithetical to having a strong Canadian response in energy policy to Donald Trump.
Couldn't agree more. I could not agree more.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, it's just fun to watch. I mean, it's 52 years, and in some people's lifetimes that they weren't born yet, and others, it's the memories have faded. But it is an important part to look at and go that there is a strategy there. There is a playbook there that could be used again. And I've been in politics my passion has been politics for 40 years, and I sit back and go, I reminisce. I guess that's the part about getting old we get to do. But I reminisce about times where you could actually sit down with your friends that were liberals or New Democrats or Green or whatever and play a game of cards and not throw the table over on each other. That is something that is completely lost. And I sit back and I lament the fact that they're not sitting and having these conversations. I mean, there's so much that is in common with all of the provinces, and there's differences, and we should appreciate those differences. But on the other hand, we need to sit down and say, what is best for us? I mean, we sit around and watch a hockey game and we go crazy, but why can't we do that in every other part of our lives?
Okay, let's talk about a fight with Ottawa that Lougheed led. That is still the stuff of lore in Alberta, and that is the National Energy Program.
Right.
This is a complex thing, so we don't want to go into too much detail.
You don't have enough time.
Yeah, we don't have dates. Never mind hours. Give us the broad strokes and what the conflict was about and how Lougheed handled it.
Well, I think this was a no-win for anybody. It was a place where, the tension was between who owned it, who was going to get all the money, are we going to nationalize, who's in control of all this? And I mean, yeah, you're right, it's so complex, but it was a policy that was made, I don't think with the, and I've argued this for years, I don't think it was the intention to screw anybody. The intention was to make good federal policy. That's what you're elected to be when you're a federal government. And this is why when, I hear my neighbors go, we got to go to Ottawa and change it. Well, I've been 50 years, I haven't watched any of them change it. They go there, they see what happens. They see that there are other mitigating circumstances to go. The NEP was something that, I mean, people that weren't even born in the 80s are still fighting a war that doesn't belong anymore. It was a good, perhaps it was a good policy. We'll never know because it didn't get to go to its end. We thought that $30 barrel was going to be $100 barrel, was going to be $200 barrel, and it fell. And I think the only thing that the Liberals really did wrong at the time was they didn't get rid of it fast enough when it was proving it wasn't working and it was decimating the industry. So it was perhaps a good, I don't know, but perhaps it was a good policy, but it stayed around too long.
Right, and part of most of it was about setting a domestic price for oil so that it was fair across the country.
Right,
and which, if you're Alberta, where you want world prices, which were higher, then you see that as everybody eating your lunch, and you want to defend your.
And the
lunch.
inequity being that there's always this talk that Ontario doesn't send cars to Alberta at a discount, and or any other resource, and that's the thing that was always there. It's just, Alberta's going to get all this money, and which again brought about the Heritage Fund, because that money, they just had so much money that was coming out of the ground.
Well, let's talk about how Lougheed handled this, because there were vicious fights between Alberta and the federal government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, which was a minority government. We should add. What happened? I mean, first of all, Alberta took Canada to court. How many times has Danielle Smith taken the federal government to court over regulations? I mean, I haven't got enough fingers to count them all.
Right.
So there's been a lot of that, and she's lost them all, by the way. And so they did that, and Lougheed also went to the court of public opinion, and he argued his case, and there were PR campaigns, and which is very analogous to today. But at the end of the day, he and Pierre Elliott Trudeau compromised, and they compromised not just once, but a number of times to try to make this work, to try to reduce the tensions and come up with a deal that would work for everybody. It didn't, but it was the essence of what Lougheed preached about statecraft. This illustrated his approach to managing tensions that involved Alberta and the federal government.
Again, you got it bang on. It was vicious, and it was there was, and then again, remember, we're also going into constitutional 1982, where again all of these ideas are coming together. We don't talk about these ideas anymore. We're afraid to put constitution on the table. We're afraid to talk about federalism because, we had Meech Lake, we had Charlottetown, we had all of these different things going on at the same time as we're fighting about these resources. But let's bring it full circle, Markham. Comes back to 1972, 73. I think this is where we start to see the flexing of the provinces and this idea that we can work together. And if you do look through, and they didn't stay all, it wasn't Quebec and Alberta were always hand in hand, or Ontario and Alberta, or Alberta and Newfoundland. They came apart. But this is what happens in families, is that you have these fights. You have like this, and then sometimes it's like, you annoy me. This is what we're going through with the NEP. It was a policy that, whether we agreed with it or not, and most people in Alberta did not agree with it. They got hurt. People got hurt every bloody day because of it. And it's hard when you're sitting, 3,000 miles away that you're going to, and kilometers, whatever, but they're that far away. They don't always see what's going on here. And there were people that lost their jobs and their homes and other things. And you can never nullify that. But they're elected to make policy. And this is where it's like, sometimes when they sat down together, these were people, the mandarins and the politicians were always going back and forth. And when they went out and had beers, the mandarins were still in the back rooms having these conversations.
That's a good point. I mean, Peter Lougheed is credited with building the modern Alberta public service. And one of the things that Danielle Smith is doing, I mean, for those of you who aren't aware, there's Canada has a public health service. About 70 or 80% of all medical services are paid for by the government under Medicare. And the administration of it is at the provincial level. And Danielle Smith there's a huge scandal going on. I won't get into the details, but that one of the principles or one of the criticisms of her that you would never hear from Peter Lougheed or about Peter Lougheed is that she is doing things, she's interfering with the decisions of the bureaucrats, the civil service, and in ways that allegedly benefit her political supporters who have donated to her party. I mean, this is the essence of corruption, right? And especially in Canada, we've had these kinds of, and now none of this has been proved, but it's playing out in the media right now. And in my opinion, unless I'm wrong on this, but I don't think Peter Lougheed would ever have treated his civil service like that. I think very different. He relied. They were what the Americans said. What did John F. Kennedy say? The best and the brightest. That's what we want to attract to Washington. That's what we want to put to use for the public, for the people of America, he said. Well,
Yep.
it's exactly the same for Lougheed. Get the best and the brightest, get them to work in government. And when we sit down with Pierre Elliott Trudeau across the table from him, we're prepared. We have the horsepower to have those debates and win them and represent the people of Alberta. Am I wrong or right?
You know what? I think you've really brought it to head with in 82 and 83 when the bottom dropped out, and obviously the NEP was playing for 99% of that, 99.99. But what happened is, if there is one criticism of Peter Lougheed that has been made, is that when he did walk away in 1985, one of the things that he had seen was the bureaucracy had grown. It had grown quite substantially. I mean, the numbers compared to the 1960s are huge. But also keeping in mind, the population also changed. I mean, in 1969, when my family moved to Alberta, Saskatchewan and Alberta literally had almost parallel populations.
Yeah, about a million.
Today, yeah, about 1 million people. And today we're looking at 4.5 million, 5 million people living in Alberta, and they're still looking at 1.2 million in Saskatchewan. Not because resources are any less in Saskatchewan. Actually, some would argue with potash and uranium, probably there's more. Agriculture is the same. There's oil sands on the Saskatchewan side. I did that for your faith. But it changed because the government had a plan for economic development. And yet when the bottom dropped out, one of the things that I think the next government under Premier Getty really had to deal with was there were school boards without schools. There were hospital boards without hospitals. The bureaucracy had built up so much that they couldn't. The money that was coming in, the income, the revenue was coming in, couldn't sustain the bureaucracy, and it's always bad bureaucracy, inefficient. But that's the reality of it. And I'm sure it killed Peter Lougheed to watch as it was, had to be dismantled in the 90s because it just was too big it was overburdening. But I think Lougheed always felt he was playing catch up. Is all these people are moving to Alberta, and yet we don't have schools, we don't have hospitals, we don't have roads, we don't have these things, and there was a lot of petrodollars, but it changed the complexity of the province.
I want to end our interview with a discussion of some of the things that he achieved in his negotiations with the oil sands.
Yeah.
Now, when I think it was 73 when Atlantic Richfield exited the Syncrude consortium. So there was the federal government, the Alberta government, and a consortium of private companies that were going to develop this. Atlantic Richfield pulled out then because the capital cost of the project had ballooned. They didn't want to be involved anymore. And so it wasn't just the Alberta government and the federal government that stepped up to the plate. It was the Ontario government, which is very odd. And one of the things that they negotiated was equity stake in Syncrude. And so Alberta got, I forget, it was 10 or 15%, and Ontario got 5%, and the federal government got something. But also, Lougheed used the Alberta Energy Company to negotiate ownership of other things. There was a pipeline into the oil sands that he had 80%, he got 100%. And then there were some other assets that he either got a majority ownership or all of the ownership of it. And those then became levers that he could then pull to do other things within the economy. And it's not just that public ownership is a tool to achieve a goal. It's that it is one of the many tools in a government's toolbox, and you use the tool that's appropriate for the job. And that's exactly what Peter Lougheed did. It's part of his brilliance is he used the tool. He wasn't afraid. Ideology didn't hold him back. It's like, okay, if we need a crown corporation to do this thing, we build a crown corporation and we go do it. And I think that's a powerful, powerful lesson for today's governments where it's only regulation and subsidies. That's what government today is limited to. And that is not what Peter Lougheed was limited to. And look what he was able to achieve. Lougheed 2.0, my friend. That's the future of Canadian energy policy. Look,
it's a great lesson.
It is. It's time to revisit the past in order to learn lessons that guide us through the future. And God knows we need some guidance. So thank you very much for this, Troy. Really appreciate it. Always a pleasure. And I have no doubt we'll have you back in the near future to talk further about Peter Lougheed.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thanks for watching the show. We are on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers and over 1 million views. If you're enjoying the content, give us a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for being part of our community.